pastor, wouldn't it be bad if your last name was Herod? A really bummer last name to be a pastor. My last name was almost Slick, so that's not a good one either.
That'd be a good name for a car salesman.
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, Mr. Slick. I was selling you a car today. Slick.
Yeah, my dad is the last Etheridge, and his dad died when he was an infant, and during the Depression. So the mom remarried quickly, and the guy that she remarried's last name was Slick. And so my dad grew up not using Etheridge as his last name, even though that was his legal last name, because he was an infant. He grew up using Slick as his last name. And he got into the military, and when he joined the military, they got birth certificate and all the information, and so he had to switch back to Etheridge, because that was his legal name. So I came that close to being a car salesman. Yeah, that's right.
You and Grace.
Yeah. Pastor Slick just wouldn't have worked. All right, I think
That'd be fun to come up with names and occupations that it wouldn't fit. That'd be a good game. All right.
There's some last names that just don't work for anybody, but I feel bad.
Yeah. Well, welcome to our continuing study of what God was doing in history. We've been in the Middle Ages for, it seems like the whole Middle Ages, for 1,000 years or so. But we're coming towards the end of the Middle Ages, and we've seen a lot of development. Yes.
Is that called the Dark Ages or?
Well, the Dark Ages usually refers to the first part of the Middle Ages. And there are some ways in which it was dark and that there was not a lot going on. People lived on manors, so the feudal system was there. But especially with the Crusades, and then there's some other developments also, people began to move around more because during the first part of the Middle Ages, people never left the manor. They made everything that they needed, and everything that they depended on was right there. They never had to leave. But when people started going to Crusades and came across goods from Asia over in the Middle East and brought those back, people started saying, hey, I like silk. Let's get some more of that, or some more sugar or whatever. And then also became exposed to literature from especially ancient Greek literature that had not been available for hundreds of years in Europe. So all that created somewhat of a revolution in Europe that took hundreds of years to develop, but eventually trade increases. People don't go back to the manors. They begin to be involved in trade, and which led to towns being formed, which led to the use of money instead of bartering, which led to the development of the middle class, which led to more prosperity, which led to more education and the establishment of universities and many other things that probably are not coming to mind, but all those things developed. So some would say that came out of the Dark Ages, and there are some ways in which it was dark from the standpoint of there was no education. People were basically illiterate, including priests, although the church was the only place where you could get education. But there were still those that were thinking and were proposing ideas, were studying, but it would have been limited pretty much to the church. Okay, you didn't know you'd get a long answer like that for such a short question, but that's the way it operates around here. You ask a question, you're liable to get
Thank you.
who knows what. Hopefully that helps. So we found that the 13th century, and then moving into the 14th century, but especially the 13th century, the 1200s, was a time of great development. A lot of things happened in the 13th century, including the Black Death, the plague, which had a huge impact upon Europe, as anywhere from, depending on where you live, 30 to 70% of the people living in different places died, which created a lot of problems, but also created opportunities. And so as we move on from there, although the Black Death comes and goes a few times, but there's a greater impact on the economy of Europe because of the middle class, development of the middle class, and trade. And there is a great impact upon the Europe educational system because of the development of universities outside of the church, no longer monasteries, but universities in the cities. And we looked for the last couple of weeks about an intellectual or academic group of men called the scholastics. We've probably been looking at them for a month. And we looked at scholasticism. Today, we're going to begin looking at the development of art and literature during this, towards the ending of the Middle Ages. And essentially what's happening is the Middle Ages, as they're coming to an end, it's only because something else is going to begin. And that's going to be the Renaissance moving into the Reformation. But it's all building in, it's all building up. Sometimes people wonder, why do we spend time studying a particular aspect of history? It's because that aspect of history influences the next aspect of history. And so we've been building up to this. And so today we want to look at the art and literature that was developing in Europe in the 13th century into the 14th century. First of all, concerning the art and literature of that time period, let's see, it's not, there we go. As we look at the Middle Ages, before art and literature develop more, we see that in all areas of art, that they're more interested in the symbolic rather than the realistic. So even in their interpretation of the Bible, they were looking for symbolic images. They were looking for allegory, looking for what can this represent. Very few people were interested, or priests, churchmen were interested in studying the Bible for what it actually says and interpreting it. That they always wanted to see, well, what's a hidden meaning. What does this symbolize that they could use practically? And of course, a lot of people do that today as well. But we're looking at all areas of art. That was the perspective. The visual arts were used to communicate Bible stories to illiterate laymen, as we were in most of the Middle Ages. Most people couldn't read, and even if they could, they couldn't afford a Bible because it was been very expensive because everything was hand copied. That's one of the things that's going to create a revolution in thinking as we get to Gutenberg later on, inventing the printing press. But throughout most of the Middle Ages, visual arts were used to teach the Bible to people, and that included mosaics, paintings, book illuminations, dramas, stained glass, and sculptures. All those things were used to communicate. For those who could read, Bible manuscripts were available with beautiful illustrations as well. So for them, and considering all the different ways of communicating through art, Bible characters and popular saints were depicted with certain characteristics so they would be recognized. So in other words, if you saw a painting of St. Francis of Assisi, for example, or of St. Paul, there were certain characteristics that were always used. So when you saw that, you didn't have to see a name under it because you couldn't read the name anyway. So people came to be able to recognize certain Bible characters and even saints by the way that they were portrayed. Now, we're going to look at some of the different kinds of art that were used to communicate these things. First, there were the mosaics. Now, a mosaic is a picture or a pattern produced by arranging together small colored pieces of hard material, such as stone, tile, or glass. And these were employed primarily in Eastern or the Byzantine Empire during the early Middle Ages. So if you go to Greece, for example, you'll see a lot of this in the old church buildings and so on. Any of you ever worked with mosaic? Sometimes people today still like to put together pictures with stones or tiles. And in the Middle East as well, you see a lot of mosaics. I hear a couple of examples. I'm not sure who that person is. It wasn't identified in the picture I found. Some of it is colorful, like on the right. Here's something that I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but you see this here? Anybody know what that is? You see? That's called the chi rho. Chi is the letter we call X. In Greek, it's called chi. And the P-looking letter is actually an R in Greek, and it has the name rho. The chi rho. Anybody ever seen that symbol anywhere? You might see it on signs, because the chi rho, being the first two letters of the name Christ in Greek, is used as a symbol for Christian. So that was a symbol for Christians, for churches, the chi rho. By the way, that's why Xmas is not necessarily a bad thing. X simply is the first letter of Christ. It's not trying to get rid of Christ, at least originally. Maybe some people do today, I don't know. But the X in Xmas is just an abbreviation for Christ. I use that quite often myself in taking notes. I use the X because it takes less time. Okay, any questions about that? I just had to notice that, point it out. So you can, I mean, we could probably examine a lot of stuff on here and see, what are these symbols demonstrating? What are they teaching? Everything on here has a purpose. Here's another mosaic. And I'm afraid that when I took Greek, I didn't pay much attention to the capital letters, uppercase letters, because my Greek New Testament was written in lowercase letters. So I thought, why bother learning all these uppercase letters if I don't need them? But unfortunately, now I do recognize the M and the R, and the O there is Omicron and a Nun. So I do know those letters, but I found when I was in Greece, I couldn't read a lot of the street signs because they were in all caps. Yes, Gary?
Is the mosaic, it's always religious stuff, but mosaic goes into the secular thing.
Yeah, but back then, that's a good question. I tell you, all the mosaics I have seen, and I'm not somebody who's seen everything or an expert, but in the Middle Ages, almost everything was religious. There was very little that wasn't. So any artwork, anything was religious in nature. And so these, you can tell who this is, right?
Yeah, Mary.
Mary and Jesus, mother and child. And I don't know who the other two people are. Probably the name right there, but I can't read that well enough to decipher it. But they're carrying buildings, it looks like, as gifts to the infant Jesus and his mother. And I'm sure that those capital letters stand for something too, but I'm not familiar with what that is. And then here's another one with simply a cross in the middle. I assume that's Jesus in the center. Oh, here's something. There's a letter, and there's a letter. Anybody know what those letters are? Those are Greek letters. You can tell what that one is. You know that letter. I don't know if you can decipher it from the way it's written. What's it look like?
Alpha.
Yeah, that's alpha. And that is omega. The first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. And we know that Jesus in Revelation is called Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. So he's everything. So that's on there. And you'll see that a lot in different pictures, paintings, drawings that are made in early Christianity and the Middle Ages as well. Well, I think those are sheep at the bottom. And unfortunately, I don't have the whole picture there. I think, I'm not positive about this, but I think that might say Savior of the world. But it would be Latin, because mundi, I think is the Latin word for the world. Salvus, salvation. That's just a guess on my part. All right, so that's mosaic. And pretty interesting stuff, and a lot of floors have mosaic on them. I've probably been in a number of church buildings, not only in Greece but in Israel, other places in which there are mosaics on the floor. And you find that in not only in church buildings but synagogues that have been excavated will have mosaic on the floor. So it was highly used as a form of art and communication. So from ancient times, that is during the time of Christ or before the time of Christ on up through the Middle Ages, but mostly in the eastern part of the empire, not so much in Western Europe. Okay, any comments or questions about mosaics? Okay. Do we have any artists in here? Anybody that's or has been interested in art? Or yeah, I'm not an artist either. I enjoy it, but so that may be good. You don't know any more about it than I do. So we'll see how that goes. All right, the next form of expression, art-wise, were called frescoes. Frescoes were paintings that were done rapidly in watercolor on wet plaster on a wall or ceiling, so that the colors penetrate the plaster and become fixed as it dries. So, you know, and I can't imagine trying to do this, but you're painting a picture into wet plaster so that it dries into the plaster.
It's interesting, you can see it looks like it's segmented, so they probably did little bits at a time.
Yeah. Yeah, you're probably right.
Hey, Bill,
Yeah,
I've just a little bit to add is I've done plaster work,
yeah.
actual plaster. I imagine so plaster dries hard within minutes, like 20 minutes. It's
So
hard.
you have to paint fast.
No,
Oh, no?
it stays wet, it stays damp to the touch
Oh,
for the modern plaster for like a day or more. The old lime plaster stayed damp to the touch for like a month.
well, that's what they use. They use limestone
Right.
or lime plaster.
So
So you'd have a month to work on it.
I'm guessing, you know, you talk about, it's more of a, it's not wet to touch. It's not like you're gonna touch it, and your finger's necessarily gonna go in it. It could have been fairly stiff,
Mhm. But still absorb the colors.
but it'll absorb it.
Huh, interesting. And I would think that would give it depth, wouldn't it? If it's, because the plaster is not totally smooth. Or is it?
You can polish it like Venetian plaster, like they run a steel trowel over it. They would have had something probably you can get it to where it's. I mean, the guys that know what they're doing, it's amazing how smooth and hard they can get that.
Yeah.
Well, and you know, when you see the parts of them in the museums, they usually are smooth. I would think there's not that much texture to it.
Okay. This became more popular than mosaics because they could show more depth and were less expensive to produce. You can imagine, you know, finding little pieces of glass, the right color, putting them together. You know, my 6-year-old grandson just put together a 1,000-piece puzzle, and I am just amazed that he was able to do that. I looked at the puzzle when it was partway done and thought, I wouldn't want to do that. And that's what just, you know, little puzzle pieces. I certainly wouldn't want to do pieces of glass or tile. And so the frescoes became more popular. One of the most famous of these artists was, and I don't, it's Italian, I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, Giotto. Anybody know how to say it better, just say so. And so we're gonna look mostly at his stuff here. This is his painting called Lamentation. And of course, that's at the death of Jesus. And the people gathered around there. Any comments or questions about the painting itself? Giotto painted episodes from the life of Christ for the interior of the Arena Chapel in Padua, Italy, between 1305 and 1315. His work was revolutionary in that he departed from the flat and solemn Byzantine icons to introduce perspective and volume, making his subjects more realistic. And I should have shown you one here to so you can contrast it, but if you've ever seen a Greek Orthodox or somewhere Byzantine icon, it's a picture and it's very flat. There's no depth to it at all. And he introduced this as a way of making it more realistic. Here's a crucifix that he painted. I believe that's a painting that's on the crucifix. And just stop me if you want to comment or question anything. But it looks like in both couple of pictures looked at already, the sky seems to have deteriorated more of the time than the people. Any insight on that, David? I suppose the whole thing was painted back already. The people were painted on top of that, maybe because of the extra layer.
Do you think it would plate or not plate?
I mean, paint does come off plaster if there's ever any water damage or whatever, but that's more of a talking latex oil, so watercolor. I don't know.
Well, I think about Da Vinci's Last Supper. It was a painting done on the wall of a chapel. I can't remember where, but I remember a couple decades ago they were concerned that it was being damaged by water, and so they had to try to restore it, which happens sometimes. Okay, here's St. Francis receiving the stigmata. I think we looked at this one before when we were looking at St. Francis of Assisi. This is where he is receiving the stigmata. Remember the nail prints in the hands and bleeding from his hands, is just like Christ did. And this is, well, can you tell what's going on here? What's happening there in the center? What's this person doing to that person?
Putting a crown on the person.
Yeah, it's a coronation. Okay. Next question is, who are they?
Is that Mary?
Yeah, that's Jesus crowning Mary. Because by this time, for quite some time in medieval Roman Catholicism, Mary had been looked at as the Queen of Heaven. She was crowned as such, which interestingly enough is the same name given to some of the pagan goddesses in Babylon and so on, which goes back to things we covered probably a couple of years ago at this point. And with Mary there are angels and saints. You can see they've got an orchestra and everything. So Pretty neat. Any other comments there? Okay, this is. Well, you can tell in the middle there, it's Mary and infant Jesus. And I don't know who the other people are.
So would these have all been paid for by the church? Do you suppose?
Either that or patron, a rich person that wanted to have artwork for their own, but most of this was done in churches, and so the church is raising money a lot of different ways, and they're trying to make their buildings beautiful and attractive and communicate the Bible to people who can't read, all those things. So yeah, they do pay people to do that. Now here's something outside of frescoes that Giotto did. He also was an architect. This is the Florence bell tower that he oversaw. And then here's another painting of St. Francis of Assisi, the exorcism of the demons. So you can see the demons represented there by those flying creatures. But you and if you haven't looked at the Byzantine art, you wouldn't notice it so much, but there is depth here that wasn't in art before this. You can see just the way that he's drawn. Look at how St. Francis is drawn. Can you observe what is it about him that gives him depth? Shading. So even the shading of his robe. If it was all one color, he would look kind of flat. But the shading of the robe, not only the shading, but the folds of the robe give it depth. What else?
Well, looking at the whole picture itself, I mean, he's in front of, the buildings, so that gives enough to it. The buildings are drawn in perspective. So
Right.
that you got that, and you got the person in the doorway who's smaller than him.
Yes.
So it's,
Good. So that idea of perspective, the things that are further away are smaller. You've got the angles of the buildings here. You've got him in front of a building. I look at the feet. See how the feet are separated, one behind the other, that gives it some depth. You look at the buildings there, they're stacked behind one another. So he and many others have figured out how to make things look more realistic, and they're concerned about doing that. Any other comments? Back. Oh, it's the screen. It's curved. Did that look curved to me? I don't know if it's the screen or what it did. Look curved. I think it was the screen maybe more. But maybe not. Okay, here is another Madonna. That is the Virgin Mary with the child Jesus. I think this is earlier than some of the other stuff. Any comments there?
Well, I was trying to compute it. At this time, babies were always just little people.
Yeah,
They weren't they didn't look like babies, they were just small.
yeah, the heads are like little adults.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think this is one too where the steps are colorful marble. I think this is just one of the features.
I mean, the shading is so strong on baby Jesus. From back here, it looks like he has a beard.
yeah.
Yeah. Because the shading is so strong.
Well, and look how dark Mary's robe is
You know,
compared to everything else. It really not only is she in the center, but it really draws attention to her with the dark robe and then the white tunic or dress. Anything else? Didn't know you were going to become art critics today, did you? This is scenes from the life of the Virgin. This is the marriage of the Virgin on the left. It comes from that place on the right where a bunch of scenes are there. This is one of them. So this is Joseph and Mary being married. And what do you notice about Mary?
Prego.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he knew how to draw a woman who was pregnant.
Yeah.
Even if she was only a little bit.
She's
So,
holding her hand.
yeah. And then not sure if this is a staff or not. Joseph holding his other hand, looks like it might be, but notice there's a dove at the top, indicating the presence of the Holy Spirit. Any other observations? And then this is the Last Judgment. Well, this has got a lot of stuff in it. You can see, and this is on a wall in at the Scrovegni Chapel. You can see Jesus is here ready for judgment. What do you suppose these people are? Yeah, the 12 apostles sitting on thrones, right? These are what? Here,
Angel.
angels. And what else do we have here?
Satan down in the corner, maybe.
Yeah, down here,
Mhm.
yeah. And this is where those that are being cast into hell that way. These are the saints. Here's apparently is the equivalent of St. Peter opening his books, although I don't think that maybe it started yet, but it looks like people that are being examined. Anything else there? Well, that's a close-up of where the artist represented his client, that is the guy who paid him to do this. Even though it's in a chapel, sometimes rich people would pay for it. His name was Enrico, and he pictures this guy presenting the church building to Christ. He's giving it. So he's honoring the guy for his magnanimity, his graciousness, and giving to the Lord. Oh, I guess that's what it is in Matthew. I just saw that. That's here. So you put the guy who paid for it down in the bottom and center. All right, the third method of using art to communicate the Bible were in book illuminations. And there are three well-known book illuminations. One is the Book of Kells, which is housed at Trinity College Library in Dublin. How many of you ever heard of the Book of Kells? Okay, it's if you travel to Ireland, it's a pretty famous thing to see. And it is an illuminated manuscript of the four Gospels of the New Testament, and it's housed there at Trinity College. It's the most famous of the medieval illuminated manuscripts for the intricacy, detail, and majesty of the illustrations. We flew into Dublin and thought, well, we've got some extra time. Let's go see the Book of Kells. Not realizing you just can't walk in. You have to have an appointment. You have to buy a ticket, essentially. And they were all filled up that day, so we weren't able to go inside. But this is what it looks like inside. So I'm not sure exactly where the Book of Kells is in there, but that's a library where it's located. Now this next one shows some illustrated pages from the Book of Kells. You can appreciate the intricacy there, the detail, and how colorful it was. At a time when books were not printed, they were copied by hand. And of course, there's the always present Virgin Child. But and the face on this one is particularly grotesque, I think.
Just creepy.
It is creepy. Any other comments there? And then here's a page of text. And of course, as you've probably seen, you know, the opening a letter, it was always embellished, a lot of artwork. But notice even the text itself. Can you imagine with pen and ink and different colored ink, basically drawing each of these letters.
Does make you wonder how many times they had to redo it for making mistakes.
Yeah. Well, probably not too many times before they would be given another job. Here's a second illustrated book called The Paris Psalter. And this is one of the illustrations from there, David composing the Psalms. Appropriate for a psalter. And then here's David glorified by the women of Israel. And then the third example of illustrated books is called the Winchester Bible, which is located in England. As you can see, this is the Bishop of Winchester, Henry of Blois. There's the detail of God addressing Jeremiah. So all through this Bible, there are these illustrations.
These have been created like ultra wealthy people. I mean, these can't have been very common.
No. And I'm not sure who exactly could even see them, look at them. Because, I mean, it wasn't like going to the library, checking it out and taking it home. You know, it's got to stay in whatever cathedral or church building it was housed. So I'm really not sure what use they had. Scenes from the life of David. All right, so that is art which is used to illustrate scenes from the Bible, but they're, and I should say, more in the line of paintings. Now we move to a different form of art, and that is drama. One way, there are three different kinds of plays that were used. One was called the mystery plays. They began as mini plays that represented biblical topics during Easter. So they thought Easter is a time when a lot of people are coming into town, a lot of people coming to the local cathedral or church building. And so this would be a good time to put on some biblical plays for people. Over time, they became longer depictions using local languages rather than Latin, as they figured out after a while, people aren't understanding what we're saying. Let's put it in their language. And they moved to the church steps and yard. And eventually they were performed by theater guilds, lay brotherhoods, and even entire towns. The subject matter could be any biblical story, although most centered around the life of Christ, especially his passion, being that Easter was the predominant time when they were put on, including his resurrection and ascension. In France, a single play called The Acts of the Apostles, you can imagine putting on a play of the Acts of the Apostles. It included 494 speaking parts and almost 62,000 lines of rhymed verse. And it took 40 days to perform. It's a long play. So that's a mystery play. Next, there was a morality play. These were allegories. The characters represented different vices, such as greed or gluttony, or virtues, such as truth or temperance. So different characters represented these different evil or good things. In York, England, the Paternoster, which is our Father, play was designed to set forth the goodness of the Lord's Prayer, linking the petitions of the Lord's Prayer to the 7 virtues and the 7 deadly sins. So they acted these things out as a way of teaching people. So that's a morality play. The main theme of morality play is man begins in innocence, man falls into temptation, man repents and is saved. Central action is a struggle against the 7 deadly sins that are personified as real characters. Kind of reminds me a little bit, and maybe this was the inspiration of John Bunyan's Puritan's Progress. You know, you have different characters in that novel that represent different things. You know, I think there's a man called Evangelist. And, you know, different people have names that are either vices or something good. It's believed that the allegory of vices and virtues fighting over man's soul goes back to the 4th century Roman epic. The allegorical application of theater to Christianity is intended to help the audience understand sin and virtue. Only 5 of these plays still survive. Here are the names of them: Pride of Life, The Castle of Perseverance, Wisdom, Mankind, and Everyman. 2 other plays are similar to morality plays that exist are Second Shepherd's Play and Hick's Corner. That's all that are left of this genre. The understanding of style has been developed based upon the influence these plays had on surviving literature and art. So those are the morality plays. So the mystery plays are plays that talk about biblical stories. The morality plays are plays that talk about morality, characterizing vice and virtue as characters. And then the third kind of play was called a miracle play. The miracle plays depicted the lives of saints, some of which were biblical subjects, such as Mary Magdalene or the conversion of Paul, usually performed on that saint's feast day. You know, all the different saints had days that were set aside for them. And as I said, some were biblical, some were not.
Bill, I looked up the illuminated manuscripts were made by monks for monks.
Yeah.
So like the Book of Kells was kept in a monastery and they used it for their use.
Yeah, I should have said that. These were done by monks. Yeah, and apparently they're the only ones that never saw them. Yeah.
Seems to be.
And you say, well, why are they making these for monks? These are supposed to be for those that are illiterate. Monks were illiterate, many of them.
We had a lot of time on it.
And they had a lot of time on their hands. But the monks were usually more educated than the priests. I will say that. The monks were, usually they were trained and educated to, to be able to read. But the priests, other times, were not. They just learned what they were set to say and said it in Latin and didn't have much else to do with it. Okay, more about the miracle plays. The oldest one that we have is called Harrowing of Hell. Tells of the descent of Christ to the hell of the damned, an Easter play. All right. Any questions about the different plays? So we've looked at different forms of art in the painting realm. We looked at art in the dramatic realm.
Who performed the plays?
That's a good question. I don't know that it was limited to monks or priests even. It seems like maybe anybody would be able to do it, because you didn't have to be able to read, you just knew the story, and so you would act it out, I suppose. I don't know, I didn't think about who was doing it. And that one play, it took what, 400 and some people, had a draw on community, I would think, but they'd have to learn their lines too. So
Seems like a huge undertaking.
not sure how that worked. Okay, now we're going to look at another advancement in painting called Romanesque painting. The Romanesque painting was thought to have three functions. One was educational, one was moralizing, and one was decorative. So combining those three together. Around 1100, Romanesque art represented Christ in majesty and the Virgin Mary enthroned. So you see that a lot. I'm afraid this isn't very clear. Didn't realize unclear it was. I would have looked for a better one, but characteristics are it's very simple. There's no volume or perspective, so there's no depth. Usually uniform in color. Figures always facing forward. So again, no depth that way either. Scenes were adapted to the architectural framework, little or no empty space. Most common motifs were scenes from the Bible and the lives of saints, sometimes representation of everyday life. This is a little bit better. They were inside churches, and they were like a book for the people who were not able to read. They were not realistic. They were rigid, schematic. They did not have background landscapes. Painted in bright colors, and mural paintings on walls of the apse were very common. So inside the church buildings, they would paint these. And this one talks about the adoration of the Magi, partitioning of the draped figures into separate decoratively modeled segments. Their pipe-like legs. Their ladder-like folds serve to keep the figure flat, contributes to the effect of still formality. Figures are cut into patterns by hard outlines. So, just like when you're a kid, maybe if you're drawing something, you draw the outline of the person and then you fill it in. Now, I'm not sure if these were considered Romanesque. I wonder now whether they may have come at a later time, because these do seem to have more depth and they're not all facing. But we'll look at them here anyway. I think they maybe did come after the Romanesque period. This is artwork on a portable communion altar that I took pictures in Germany. It was a communion altar. I mean, because they had to make these things portable so they could serve communion to people who couldn't make it to church, or there wasn't a church in their community. They would go around and use this as a way to draw people to partake of the Eucharist or the Mass. And this thing, one of the things that's remarkable about this, and you'll see the pictures are pretty well done. But this was in a basement I can't remember if it was a church or museum. I think it was a church museum in Germany. And there was nobody around. Well, this thing is I think from the 13th or 14th century. There's nobody around guarding it. There's no one making sure that no one touches it. It's just there. And you walk up and look at it, whatever. Unlike in this country, I've made the mistake sometimes of pointing at a painting at the butler and an alarm goes off and get away from the painting, the voice said, something like that. If you do that enough times, the guard comes around and starts following you. Found out. Some more paintings of the beating of Christ. And these are all in panels that fold up and they go from place to place. Thought it was interesting how they have the men on the cross. Jesus, of course, with the nails through the palms of his hands, which was not the way it was, but they didn't know any better. But the two thieves with him were just roped to the crosses. I don't know whether that was because they thought that Jesus must have suffered more, and so they wanted to portray that. But also, if you look at the clothing of most medieval paintings, it's not the clothing of the time of Jesus. When you look at the armor, it's obviously the clothing at the time that the painters painted, which you find most of the time up even through the Renaissance. So I'm guessing, well, what would you guess? I have a guess as to what this is. Tell what the details, what's going on here. The ideas?
The woman's holding an apple,
Ah,
and obviously like a Satan and up in the
yeah, up
corner.
there, and this is Jesus. You got the nail prints in his feet, and you can see that in his hand. And he's carrying a banner. Here we say a victory banner. So where is he?
I can't see what's underneath his feet.
Okay, does anyone else see what that is? It's a grotesque figure, either a demon or maybe Satan himself, that Jesus is trampling underfoot,
This is like where they're trying to make it out of purgatory.
or even hell. I mean, we could say that Jesus is going to Hades. It could be purgatory, but I think we can relate this to the fact that those who died went to Hades before the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And so and we're told, where is it, First Peter, that Jesus went to the place of the dead and announced or preached to those that were there, announced the victory, announced that in his death, basically he went there and said, I've been victorious, I've paid the penalty for your sins, now let's get out of here. And that would represent, since she's holding fruit, that would represent who would be there that is associated with fruit? Eve, right? And with her is probably Adam, I imagine. And I don't know whether we can identify the others there or not. But you can see demonic characters back there as well. Interesting. And what's that?
Coming out of the tomb,
Hmm?
coming out of the grave.
Yeah, the resurrection. All right, any comments about these panels? I don't think they're Romanesque now that I think about it. But they are from the Middle Ages. All right, now let's consider architecture. There was what was called Romanesque architecture from around 1050 to 1150. So this is before things really start to change in the 13th century. So this is the way churches were built before we get to that period where a lot of changes take place. They constructed churches in that period of time in the shape of a Latin cross. So this is looking down on a church building. And you can see that it's in the shape of a cross. This is called the nave. That's the area that's leading up to the front. That's called the apse. The front of the church building. This is the crossing because, you know, there's the cross there. And so that's the basic design of the church structure. Here is a drawing. And we can see a number of the features of a Romanesque church. Usually one or two towers near the main entrance. Here's a buttress that is gives support to the wall. Barrel vault. The crossing is indicated there. Let's see. One or more naves form a long armed cross. They sometimes have more than one floor. But that's the basic design. And you can see from the size of the figures there that they were built to be rather large. Romanesque architecture featured thick walls to support the tremendous weight of the stone vaults and ceilings. They, at this point, didn't know how we're going to have all that weight up there in the ceiling unless we have really thick walls to support it. They had rounded arches that you can see in this building and especially the insert. By the way, that not only thick walls, but they couldn't have very many doors and windows either because it had to support all that tremendous weight of the vaults and the ceilings. So any doors and windows had to be small. See, rounded arches. They used heavy columns again to support all that weight. And then as we saw on the previous diagram, they had buttresses, which were vertical support columns or that rested on a wall to provide additional support. Romanesque buttresses were generally a flat, square profile and do not project a lot beyond the wall. So they're pretty close to the wall. And then they had towers that could be circular, octagonal, or square. But because there was little place for doors and windows, because you couldn't take a chance that the wall wouldn't hold up the ceiling, that means that inside it was what?
Dark.
Dark. Dark. Let's see what we can learn.
In Beverly Minster, in Beverly, England, and we wanted to talk about the basic elements of a Gothic church.
And probably the most basic element that identifies the Gothic style is the use of a pointed not a round, a pointed arch.
The pointed arch was a Gothic innovation that allowed Gothic architects to do what they really wanted to do, which was to build larger and lighter churches.
Light was associated with God, with the divine.
Whoops, I forgot. This is about the next kind of architecture, Gothic. I was thinking I had one about Romanesque, but this is about Gothic architecture that came after this. And so you'll see a lot of contrast between what we've been looking at and the kind of architecture, the kind of churches that were constructed from the Gothic method.
It's a perfect metaphor. Light has an almost magical quality in that it can pass through a solid, it can pass through glass.
Romanesque churches, just before the Gothic period, required large, thick expanses of wall to hold up the ceiling, usually a barrel vaulted ceiling. So from the rounded barrel vault, the architects moved on to the groin vault.
The weight of round art pushes outward and requires a lot of buttressing, big solid wall underneath. The pointed arch redirects its weight more directly downward so that the supports can be thinner and can be more delicate. And the Gothic architects brilliantly realized that that innovation would allow them to be able to have less wall and more window.
The weight of the vault didn't need to come down onto continuous walls, but it could come down onto 4 columns, opening up not just the walls to windows, but opening up the very space of the church itself.
We might ask them, how is the stone vaulting held up? And the answer can be found in 2 places. First, if you look in between the glass, you can see a major structural element which comes down to the nave level in the form of a pier. Now, Gothic architects camouflage the massiveness of their piers by ornamenting them with delicate, thin colonnettes. But this was a massive object that helps to support the stone vaulting above. But there's another structural system that's at work. Even with the pointed arch, the vaulting of these churches still created lateral thrusts that pushed outward. And so the building had to be contained. It had to be supported from the outside. It had to be buttressed.
And that's where we see one of the great features of Gothic architecture, the flying buttress, essentially a bracing in between the windows on the outside of the church.
And because they are relatively delicate and pierced, they allow light to get to the windows and flood the interior with brightness.
When we look up along the wall of a typical Gothic church, we usually see 3 parts. We see the pointed arches that form the nave arcade. We see above that the triforium, and then above that the clerestory, the level with windows. When we look at the triforium, even there we see the wall is pierced. Here in Beverly Minster, we see trefoil-shaped arches, and within that trefoiled arch, we see a quatrefoil, and then below that, yet another level of opening of these short, pointed arches that are separated by columns. So it's layering that allows the wall to have a sense of depth.
All of this brings our eye upward. It emphasizes the heavenly. The intent of the Gothic church is to create a sense of the heavenly on earth.
If you imagine a typical person's home in the 13th century, you imagine something rather dark and without a lot of windows. And so coming into a space like this must have seemed truly miraculous. It's even difficult, I think, for us in the 21st century to imagine the workmanship, the decades of labor and the enormous costs that went into these buildings as places of worship, of places of connection to the divine.
Hard for me to imagine how they even figured out how to do that stuff, let alone do it. Okay, the word Gothic comes from the Dark Age, when barbarians from the north ruined ancient art, replaced it with their own culture. The Goths are those that conquered Rome in 410. There's little damage, but it became known as the first tribe of barbarians, and thus the name Gothic. It began mainly in France, where architects were inspired by Romanesque architecture and the pointed arches of Spanish Moorish architecture, that's the Muslims. It's easy to recognize Gothic buildings because of their arches, ribbed vaulting, flying buttresses, elaborate sculptures, and stained glass windows. It was originally known as the French style. And then when we get to the Renaissance, it fell out of fashion. They marked it as Gothic to suggest it was the crude work of German barbarians. So Gothic was really a name given to it by those who came later as a term of degradation. Oh, that's Gothic. And examples are Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris and St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin. And I would also say, we stumbled upon by chance, the cathedral in Strasbourg, France. It was modeled after the one in Notre Dame, and I'll show you pictures of that. So the characteristics of Gothic architecture: airy and bright, focus on verticality, that is looking up, pointed arches, rib vaults, flying buttresses, large stained glass windows, ornaments, and pinnacles. This is a picture of the Strasbourg Cathedral, and those are the flying buttresses and what you saw in the video. And that is one of the features of Gothic architecture. There's the reason behind it. So it absorbs the forces, gravity, wind, weight, all that. Atmosphere, dignity, and serenity through its spaciousness and loftiness. High towers, pointed arches, we already talked about that. Turning their thoughts to God. Stained glass windows added beauty, light, color, and also served as a visual Bible. So you can see the difference between the Romanesque and the Gothic. Same basic shape, but the interior is vastly different. There's structure. Okay, here are the pinnacles that are a feature of the Gothic architecture. There's the Cologne Cathedral, famous for all its pinnacles. Pointed arch. So not just curved, but pointed upward. Explains a little bit about that. And the change from Romanesque to the Gothic. It's called the tracery. It's the series of thin stone frames inlaid in window openings to support the glass. These are delicate web-like tracings that help increase the glass to stone ratio. The rib vaults that we mentioned before. The rib vaulting. Compare the Romanesque vault to the Gothic vault. So I'll call the oculus. The oculus was usually a round, well, I mean, no, it was a round shape that sometimes was divided up but allowed light to come in. There's another one. It's in the dome of a cathedral. And then another feature of Gothic architecture was the gargoyles. They were usually a way to take water away from the walls. So their mouths are open because water would come through and come out their mouths. And therefore the water wouldn't be running down the wall. So the water would be like a gutter or something like that, and the water would then go out through the gargoyles. And they were rather grotesque most of the time, as I guess a way of kind of scaring people as they came into the cathedral. That one's even chewing on a human being, it looks like, on the left. Okay, here are different features shown in a Gothic cathedral: tower, spire, pinnacle. You see the rose window or the oculus, gargoyles, all those things are there. So the interior of a Gothic cathedral was much more open. This is the front of the cathedral in Strasbourg, and I was just taken with the intricacy of the carving that was done on this. I don't know if you can, well, you can see all these figures, all of this, just detailed carving all the way up. Of course, that's the way Notre Dame is as well. And after the fire, replacing all that has to be a tremendous task. Just another angle. Just beautiful. And you can stand there for hours just looking at the beauty of it.
Fathom how they did that.
I know. What craftsmanship.
Well, the thing is, that's, thing to keep in mind is that's all hand cut stone. There's no concrete, there's no rebar.
Yeah. And wood.
It's
I mean,
all, it's all, you know, done by hand, and it's all self-supporting, like. You don't, I mean, where do you find anything being built like that today? Everybody thinks that modern is so much better. If we had to replace, you know, do that today, I don't know that we could do it.
well, that's what I wonder about the Notre Dame Cathedral after the fire. Are they going to be able to replace that?
I've seen pictures of it. And they're in the process of it now, and there's just a scaffolding alone. Like, I don't know how many million pieces of scaffolding around this thing.
I could imagine.
It's, you can't even, like, I don't know if anybody in the last 2 months, you know, we driving down 224, saw the scaffolding in front of the Methodist church in Poland there.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you know, that was a decent amount of scaffolding.
Yeah.
Well, that's like 1/10 of 1% of what they've got around Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And all of the work that they're doing to try to rebuild that.
Yeah. And you can see it took decades to build these cathedrals, sometimes even 100 years or more. There's a different church building inside at the Rothenburg, Germany. And every time I see one of these pulpits, anybody know what this is? Called sounding board. And what that is, as the person is speaking, his voice would hit the sounding board and be projected.
Oh, wow.
I always wanted to go up on one of those. They usually have a rope across it saying, you know, and so you can't keep up. But there was one time I was in a place that didn't have a rope, and I said to Beth, "Oh, I'm gonna go up there." She said, "No, you better not." Okay, I said I didn't. I was checking. But you can see the stained glass windows, the altar area, again, intricate detail inside as well. Even with the windows tell stories. And this was a huge carved area inside the building there. Oh, this is a statue of Moses. What do you notice about Moses? He has horns. And that's because of a mistranslation by Jerome of the Latin version, the Vulgate, in which he misunderstood a Hebrew word, and so he translated it as horns. And so people thought that Moses had horns. This is a kitchen area inside of a monastery attached to a church building. And that's the chain they used. The chain. Oh, that's the chimney up above. The chain would, be used to move things around or pot around, whatever. I thought this was interesting. Any extra food or drink that they had, they would put in this, and it was, it would turn it, and then it would turn to the outside, and the outside wall, and the poor could come and get. That's their dishwasher. Wastewater went out the hole. And this is St. Nicholas Church in Strasbourg, which became a Protestant church. Let's see, one of those. Not sure how many more I have here. Same kind of what we saw. Okay. Next time, do you remember the film we watched about the building of the pyramids? Were you here for that? Same guy did one on the building of a cathedral. If you watch that, he's very good, very good, and it'll be very interesting. So next week will be our last week before Christmas break, and we're going to watch that film on the building of a cathedral. And as we've been marveling at the end result, I think you'll also marvel at how they get there. All right. Let me remind you too to tune into my program, Discovering His Story, which is on yctv.org. And if you go to the archives, you can watch from the beginning. Right now, the latest episodes are in ancient Egypt, and I think that's a pretty interesting time period. So thanks for coming out. See if we can bring some more people next week. Hopefully Leonard will be back as well.